The laptop chimed once on the kitchen counter, a soft, innocent sound that detonated my entire world. I was reaching for a coffee mug when the notification appeared on the screen my husband had left open. Separation timeline and asset division draft. Final review. The words stared back at me, each one perfectly clear, impossible to misinterpret. I froze with my hand suspended in midair, staring as if the words might suddenly rearrange themselves into something harmless, something explainable, something that didn't mean what they obviously meant. My husband Garrett was in the shower upstairs. I could hear water running through the pipes, could hear him humming something cheerful and familiar. 20 minutes earlier, he'd kissed my forehead before heading upstairs, asking what I wanted for dinner like he'd done thousands of times before. Now I stood in our kitchen, my hands going completely numb, my chest locking up like someone had compressed all the air out of my lungs. The laptop screen glowed with casual destruction. A document outlining the systematic dismantling of our 12-year marriage, opened carelessly on the counter where I made breakfast every morning. I realized with horrible clarity, before the shower water shut off upstairs, before Garrett came back down with damp hair and that easy smile, that my marriage had already ended. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. Without even the courtesy of a conversation. I didn't cry. Some part of me expected tears, expected my body to collapse under the weight of this discovery. But I didn't scream either. Didn't throw the laptop across the room or storm upstairs to confront him through the bathroom door. Instead, I just stood there in the kitchen we'd renovated together 3 years ago, listening to the shower continue running upstairs, feeling something ancient and cold slide into place inside my chest. Betrayal, I learned in that moment, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it arrives quietly and waits patiently while you process its presence. The document was still open on the screen. I could see section headers outlining property division, financial accounts, proposed timelines. My name appeared throughout, but only as a subject being discussed, never as a participant in the discussion. I was a problem being solved, an obstacle being navigated, a complication being managed through careful planning. The shower shut off upstairs. I had maybe 3 minutes before Garrett would come back down. 3 minutes to decide how to handle the fact that my husband had been planning to leave me while pretending everything was completely normal. 3 minutes to choose between confrontation and strategy. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, angle and position precise. Then I forced my face into something neutral, something that wouldn't reveal the devastation happening behind my eyes, and waited for him to step back into the room where our marriage had just ended. My name is Melissa Hartwell. I'm 36 years old, a former marketing director who'd paused my career 8 years ago to manage our household when Garrett's job required frequent travel. I was his wife of 12 years, the one who'd handled all the invisible labor that kept our life running smoothly. The meal planning, the social calendar, the financial management, the endless coordination that made everything else possible. I'd believed deeply in partnership, in the idea that marriage meant mutual respect and transparent communication. I trusted that if problems emerged, we'd address them together like adults who'd chosen to build a life as a team. Garrett came back into the kitchen with damp hair, wearing casual weekend clothes, that familiar easy smile on his face. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder the way he'd done for years. "Coffee smells good," he said warmly. He smelled like soap and shampoo, clean and familiar. I stood rigid in his embrace, feeling like I was standing next to a complete stranger. Someone I'd never actually known despite spending 12 years sleeping beside him, building a life with him, trusting him with everything. "What do you feel like for dinner?" he asked, releasing me and moving toward the coffee pot. His voice was casual, affectionate, completely normal. I watched him pour coffee into his favorite mug and realized he had no idea I knew. Had no idea his secret planning had been accidentally revealed by a carelessly opened laptop. He thought I was still oblivious, still trusting, still the wife who could be managed and surprised on his preferred timeline. At dinner that evening, Garrett laughed too easily at something I said, asked detailed questions about my day like he genuinely cared about my answers. talked enthusiastically about a trip we should take soon. Maybe that bed and breakfast in Vermont we discussed last year. Every word landed wrong now. Every gesture felt false. I watched his mouth move, forming words about our future together, and understood with brutal clarity that he'd been rehearsing this normalcy, maintaining the facade of marriage while secretly planning its end. How long had he been doing this? How many dinners had we shared while he mentally calculated asset division? How many times had he kissed me goodnight while reviewing separation timelines in his mind? I nodded at appropriate moments, asked follow-up questions about the Vermont trip, laughed when he made a joke about the restaurant's terrible service last time we'd visited. And the entire time I was storing every detail, documenting his performance in my memory, saying absolutely nothing about the document I'd seen. Because confronting him immediately would have been reactive, emotional, exactly what he probably expected if his plan was ever discovered prematurely. And I refused to give him that advantage. I refused to be the hysterical wife losing control while he maintained calm rationality. So I played along with his performance, matching his fake normalcy with my own, while my mind raced through implications and possibilities behind the mask I'd learned to wear in the space of a single afternoon. That night, after Garrett fell asleep easily beside me, memories ambushed me with cruel precision. Late nights when I'd supported his career goals, sometimes at the expense of my own professional advancement. Conversations where we'd talked about forever and growing old together with what had seemed like genuine emotion. The promises he'd made during our wedding vows, words I'd believed completely, that had felt solid and real and permanent. I'd thought we'd been building something together. Partnership, life, future. But lying there in the dark listening to Garrett breathe steadily in his sleep, I realized those promises hadn't broken suddenly. They'd been hollowed out quietly, slowly. Over time I couldn't precisely identify. While I'd been trusting completely, he'd been pulling away gradually, planning his exit methodically, preparing to abandon everything we'd built while maintaining the appearance of commitment. The betrayal wasn't just the separation planning itself. It was the sustained deception required to execute it. The months, maybe longer, of him looking me in the eye and saying, "I love you," while secretly consulting with attorneys. The affectionate moments that were actually performances. The future discussions that were deliberate lies meant to keep me unsuspecting until he was ready to announce his departure on his carefully chosen timeline. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay there processing, planning, deciding who I needed to become to survive what was coming. I made a decision before sunrise. I would not confront Garrett about what I'd discovered. I would not reveal that I knew his secret. I would not react emotionally or demand immediate explanations. Instead, I would learn everything calmly, methodically, legally. I would understand the full scope of his planning before deciding how to respond. Shock turns people reckless, I understood instinctively. Surprise gives advantage to the person who's been preparing. Garrett had been planning for what felt like a long time based on that document's detail. He had strategies, timelines, probably legal advice informing his approach. If I confronted him now, raw with betrayal and operating on pure emotion, I'd be fighting from a position of disadvantage. He'd been preparing. I'd be reacting. So instead I chose patience, strategic silence. I would use the time before his planned revelation to prepare myself, to understand my legal position, to protect my interests, to ensure that when this separation happened, because clearly it was happening, I wouldn't be blindsided and scrambling. Garrett thought he had exclusive access to planning and preparation. He thought I was oblivious, trusting, the kind of wife who could be managed through careful timing and presentation. That assumption, I realized as dawn light started filtering through our bedroom windows, was going to be his greatest tactical error. Because I wasn't oblivious anymore. And I was very good at planning when properly motivated. He'd underestimated me fundamentally. That mistake would shape everything that followed. 3 days after discovering the separation document, I scheduled an appointment described simply as financial planning consultation. The office was discreet, located in a building 30 minutes from our neighborhood where I was unlikely to run into anyone we knew. I'd found the attorney through careful online research, looking specifically for someone who specialized in family law and asset protection. Sitting in her quiet, professional office, I explained everything without emotion. Showed her photos I'd taken of the document on Garrett's laptop before he'd closed it later that first day. Outlined our financial situation, our marriage history, what I'd discovered about his secret planning. The attorney, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Sullivan, listened carefully. Her eyebrows lifted slightly when I showed her the document photos, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "You're smart to come in early," she said after I'd finished explaining. "Before confronting him. Before he knows you're aware of his plans. This gives us time to prepare properly, to protect your interests before everything becomes reactive and emotional." That word, early, resonated with something deep in my chest. I wasn't too late. I hadn't already lost by being blindsided. I'd accidentally discovered his planning before he'd intended, and that unexpected knowledge could be transformed into advantage if I used it correctly. For the first time since seeing those words on the laptop screen, I felt something unfamiliar settling over me. Control. Agency. The sense that I wasn't just a victim of Garrett's decisions, but an active participant in shaping what happened next. Felt strange and powerful simultaneously. With Patricia's guidance, I started reviewing financial records I already had legal access to as a spouse on joint accounts. I wasn't stealing or hiding anything, just carefully examining what was already mine to examine. The pattern emerged with disturbing clarity over several hours of methodical review. Accounts had been carefully structured over the past 6 months. Retirement funds separated more distinctly. Savings gradually redistributed. Small changes that wouldn't trigger suspicion individually but created a clear pattern when viewed together. Garrett hadn't just considered leaving recently. He'd been engineering his exit for months, making financial adjustments that would simplify separation when he was finally ready to announce it. The realization didn't break me the way I'd expected betrayal to feel. Instead, it sharpened me, made me more focused, more determined, more strategic in my own planning. He'd been preparing the battlefield. Fine. Now I would prepare myself. Patricia helped me understand my legal position. What assets were genuinely joint versus separate property. What I was entitled to based on our years of marriage and my career sacrifices for his advancement. What protections I could establish now, quietly, without alerting Garrett that I knew anything. Every session with Patricia, every document we reviewed, every strategy we discussed, it all transformed my shock and hurt into something more useful. Not revenge exactly, but certainly not passive acceptance. I was becoming someone Garrett wouldn't recognize. Someone who could plan as carefully and strategically as he'd been planning. Someone who wouldn't be easily managed or surprised. The morning routine continued like always. Garrett poured coffee, asked if I wanted cream, made small talk about his day's schedule. I studied his face while he spoke, searching for signs of guilt or discomfort. Found nothing. He was completely at ease. Comfortable in his deception. That comfort, I realized, came from assuming I was exactly where he'd left me mentally. Trusting, unsuspecting, easy to manage. He had no idea I'd seen the separation document. Had no idea I was consulting attorneys and reviewing financial records and building my own understanding of our situation. His confidence in his secret gave him that steady hand, that calm demeanor, that ability to pour coffee and discuss whether like everything was perfectly normal. I wondered how long he'd been practicing this particular skill. Had it come naturally, or had he needed time to perfect appearing normal while planning something devastating? Had there been moments where guilt almost broke through? Or had he rationalized this deception so thoroughly that it felt justified? I asked him neutral questions about work, about his upcoming business trip next week, about whether we should have the neighbors over for dinner soon. He answered easily, adding details that made his lies more believable. And the entire time I was cataloging everything, storing details Patricia had told me might become relevant. watching him reveal himself without knowing he was being observed. He thought I was oblivious. That belief was his greatest weakness now. Because oblivious people don't prepare. They don't gather evidence. They don't build legal strategies. They just trust until the moment trust is shattered by announcement. But I was doing all those things. Quietly. Carefully. With the kind of patience that comes from understanding strategic silence is more powerful than emotional confrontation. I started asking subtle questions. Nothing obvious or suspicious. Just casual inquiries about our future during normal conversations. Do you still want to renovate the basement next year? I'd ask over dinner. Garrett would answer thoughtfully, discussing budget and timeline like it was genuine planning. Should we start thinking about that European trip we've talked about? He'd nod enthusiastically, suggesting we look at dates this weekend. Every answer was smooth, reassuring, detailed. Too smooth, actually. Too rehearsed. I could see the cracks now that I knew what to look for. The slight pause before answering questions about long-term plans. The vague language that sounded committal but wasn't really. The way he'd redirect conversation away from concrete future commitments toward more abstract discussions. Lies needed constant maintenance, I realized. They required energy and attention to keep consistent. Truth didn't. Truth was effortless because it just existed without requiring performance. Garrett was performing constantly now that I was watching carefully. Performing normalcy, performing commitment, performing a future he'd already decided wouldn't happen. And that performance required effort. He couldn't completely hide once I'd learned to recognize what I was seeing. Patricia had explained this would happen. That once I knew about his deception, I'd start noticing patterns I'd previously missed or dismissed. That awareness would make his lies increasingly visible. She was right. I was seeing everything differently now. Every conversation revealed more about his strategy, his timeline, his planning. And he had no idea I was gathering all of it as evidence and insight. Each document I found, each financial adjustment I discovered, confirmed more than just Garrett's plans. They revealed his assumptions about me. He'd assumed I wouldn't notice small financial changes. That I'd accept his explanations without investigation. That I'd remain trusting and unsuspecting until he was completely ready to announce his departure on his preferred timeline. He'd assumed I would panic when finally told. That I'd be so shocked and emotional that he'd maintain control of the separation process while I scrambled to understand what was happening. That assumption of my incompetence, my naivety, my inability to handle complexity, that's what left evidence everywhere. Arrogant people got careless. They stopped being careful about covering tracks because they genuinely believed the other person was too stupid or trusting to notice. Garrett had been increasingly careless over the past few months. I could see it now in the financial records. Transfers that weren't well explained. Account changes he'd mentioned only briefly. Legal consultation charges he'd labeled vaguely. None of it would have seemed suspicious if I hadn't known what I was looking for. But knowing his secret, all of it became transparently obvious. He'd built his entire strategy on the foundation of me remaining ignorant. That foundation was crumbling now without him realizing it. And every piece of evidence he'd left carelessly behind was now documented, photographed, and filed with my attorney. His arrogance was building my case for me. I kept all routines completely normal. Went to work at my part-time job. Met friends for coffee. Ran errands. Attended the book club I'd been part of for years. From the outside, nothing about my life had changed. Garrett certainly didn't notice any difference in my behavior or mood. But inside I was assembling clarity piece by piece. Each attorney session added to my understanding. Each document review revealed more of his planning. Each conversation with Patricia helped me see my situation more strategically and less emotionally. There was no rage, which surprised me. I'd expected fury, devastation, the kind of emotional breakdown that seemed appropriate for discovering your spouse's betrayal. Instead, I felt focused, clear-minded, purposeful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe this was what it felt like to finally prioritize your own interests after years of accommodating someone else's needs. Maybe this was what happened when trust was broken so thoroughly that you stopped trying to preserve it and started protecting yourself instead. Whatever the psychology, the practical effect was that I functioned better than I had in months. Slept more soundly despite the circumstances. Woke with clarity about daily priorities. Moved through my routines with efficiency and purpose. Garrett commented on it once, saying I seemed really together lately. He had no idea what I was actually together about. Had no idea the organization and focus he'd noticed was being directed entirely toward preparing for the separation he thought was his secret to control and time. 2 weeks after discovering the document, Garrett told me we needed to talk. His voice carried that particular tone of rehearsed concern. Serious but not alarming, thoughtful but not cold. He'd probably practiced that exact tone, getting it calibrated to achieve the emotional effect he wanted. My pulse didn't change. Didn't spike with anxiety or dread. Because I already knew what he was going to say. I just hadn't told him that I knew. That I'd been preparing for exactly this conversation since the moment his laptop had betrayed his secret. Okay, I replied calmly. When? Tonight. After dinner. There was that careful phrasing. After dinner, after normal routine, to minimize immediate emotional impact. Strategic timing to keep me off balance. That works, I said simply. Garrett looked almost disappointed that I hadn't asked worried questions or shown anxiety about why he wanted to talk. He'd probably expected some reaction he could manage, some concern he could soothe with reassurances before the actual conversation. But I gave him nothing. Just calm agreement to his suggested timeline. That evening I made dinner like always. Set the table. Served the meal I'd planned earlier in the week. We ate together, making normal conversation about our days. Garrett seemed increasingly tense as the meal progressed, clearly anticipating the conversation to come. I remained perfectly calm. 'Cause I already knew the script. I just never told him I'd already read it. That I'd been preparing my own responses for 2 weeks while he'd been finalizing his rehearsed announcement. After dinner, Garrett asked me to sit with him in the living room. He positioned himself carefully on the couch, hands folded in his lap, expression arranged into something serious and regretful. His eyes looked damp, like he'd worked up some emotion before this moment. Melissa, he began, his voice carefully controlled. I need to talk to you about something that's been weighing on me for a while now. He paused, waiting for me to show concern or worry. I just looked at him steadily, giving him nothing to react to. I think we need to be honest about where we are as a couple, he continued. I feel like we've been growing apart over the past year. That we want different things from life. That maybe we've stayed together out of habit more than genuine connection. The words sounded practiced. Gentle. Designed to spread blame evenly, to make separation sound mutual and reasonable rather than his unilateral decision. I think we should separate, he said finally. Take some time apart to figure out what we really want. Do this respectfully, with care for each other, without making it ugly or adversarial. He waited for tears, for shock, for the emotional breakdown his carefully calibrated speech was designed to manage. I gave him silence instead. Just looked at him for a long moment, watching him wait for the reaction that wasn't coming. His brow started to furrow slightly, confusion entering his expression. This wasn't going according to his plan. After letting the silence stretch uncomfortably, I spoke. Thank you for being honest with me, I said calmly. The words landed wrong in the air between us. Too controlled. Too measured. Not the emotional response he'd anticipated and prepared for. Garrett's face shifted, confusion becoming more evident. You're thanking me. You've made a decision about our marriage, I continued in that same steady tone. I appreciate you telling me directly rather than just disappearing or creating more conflict. His eyes narrowed slightly. This definitely wasn't his expected script. I thought you'd be more upset, he said carefully. I'm upset, I replied. But I've had time to think about our relationship too. About the distance between us. About whether this marriage is working for either of us. That was true, technically. I had been thinking about those things for 2 weeks since discovering his planning. But he heard it as though I'd been having similar doubts independently. Power shifted right there at the table. Quietly but unmistakably. Because Garrett had built his entire approach on surprising me, on maintaining control through information advantage and strategic timing. If I wasn't surprised, if I'd been thinking critically about our marriage too, then his carefully constructed strategy was already failing. He'd expected grief. Expected pleading or anger. Expected to be the one managing my emotions while calmly executing his plan. Instead, I was calm and he was the one suddenly off balance. I decided to reveal more. Not everything, I wasn't going to show all my cards yet. But enough to shift the conversation fundamentally. When are you planning to move out? Yes. Garrett blinked. I thought we'd discuss that. Figure out timing together. You've been planning this for months, I said, my voice still steady and factual. There's already a timeline. Asset division proposals. Financial arrangements. I referenced specific details from the document I'd seen. Phrases that had been in that separation draft. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened but no words came out initially. How did you? He finally managed. Your laptop, I said simply. 2 weeks ago. The document was open when I came into the kitchen. Watching his expression change was like watching someone's entire strategic foundation crumble in real time. Shock, then horror. Then something like fear as he realized the advantage he'd thought he possessed had disappeared weeks ago. You've known for 2 weeks. His voice came out strained. I've known that you've been planning to leave me while pretending everything was fine, I corrected. Yes. For 2 weeks. Garrett's hands moved to his face. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me go through this whole speech when you already knew? Because I needed time, I replied honestly. Time to process what I'd learned. Time to understand what you'd been planning. Time to prepare for a conversation I never thought we'd be having. Pause. The same things you were doing, actually. Except you had months to prepare while lying to me about our future. I only had 2 weeks. The conversation that followed was harder and uglier than his carefully planned version. Garrett's script had completely fallen apart once he realized I'd known for weeks. His rehearsed calm evaporated into defensive explanations that contradicted each other. I was going to tell you sooner, he said, his voice strained. I just needed to make sure everything was organized first so we could separate cleanly. You needed to make sure you had maximum control, I corrected. That I'd be blindsided and emotional while you remained calm and strategic. That's not consideration. That's manipulation. He tried to regain ground. This doesn't change anything. We're still separating. I still think this is the right decision. I agree, I said and watched him blink in surprise. I do think separation is right. But not the way you planned it. Not with you controlling all the information and timing while I scrambled to understand what was happening. What are you saying? I'm saying I've already sought legal guidance, I replied calmly. That I understand my rights and our financial situation. That everything moving forward will be structured, transparent, and documented properly. No ambushes. No surprises. No strategic advantages based on who knew what when. Garrett stared at me like I was a stranger. In some ways I suppose I was. The wife he'd thought he was managing. Trusting, unsuspecting, easy to control. That person had stopped existing the moment I'd seen his separation document. This new version of me, the one who could plan and prepare and protect her own interests, wasn't someone he'd anticipated dealing with. His control over this situation was evaporating, and we both knew it. The real twist came when I revealed what I'd been doing during those 2 weeks. I've hired Patricia Sullivan, I said, naming the attorney. Garrett's eyes widened. He clearly knew the name, probably knew her reputation. She's been helping me understand our financial situation, my legal rights, what I'm entitled to based on our marriage and my career sacrifices. Everything's documented now. Everything's transparent. You hired an attorney before even talking to me? His voice carried accusation and disbelief. You hired one before talking to me, I pointed out. That separation document you were working on wasn't drafted without legal advice. So yes, once I discovered you'd been consulting attorneys while lying to me about our future, I did the same thing. Garrett tried a different approach. This doesn't need to be adversarial. We can do this cooperatively. I want to do it cooperatively, I agreed. But cooperation requires both people having adequate information and representation. You were never planning to cooperate, you were planning to manage and control. Those are very different things. I could see him mentally recalculating, trying to figure out how to regain ground he hadn't realized he'd lost. But there was no going back to his original plan. That required me being ignorant and him having information advantage. We were negotiating from equal positions now, whether he liked it or not. I've already started the process of establishing financial independence, I continued. Protecting assets I brought into the marriage. Documenting my contributions to household management and your career advancement. Everything your separation plan tried to minimize or ignore. His face showed genuine shock now. The confident man who'd been humming in the shower while planning my blindside was gone, replaced by someone realizing his careful strategy had been undermined before it could even be executed. Over the following days, I watched Garrett's confidence collapse in stages. He'd try to reset conversations, to regain the control he'd assumed would be his throughout this process. But confidence dies quickly when it's exposed as being based on false assumptions. He'd thought I'd panic, I'd prepared. He'd thought I'd be emotional, I'd been strategic. He'd thought I'd be alone and confused. I'd been consulting professionals. Every assumption he'd built his plan around had been wrong, and that reality was breaking down his composure piece by piece. I could see him recalculating constantly, trying to figure out how much I knew, what I'd documented, what I'd prepared. Realizing the exit he'd planned so carefully no longer belonged entirely to him. We were both divorcing now. Both making decisions about how to separate. Both had legal representation and understanding of rights and options. His unilateral control had become mutual negotiation. That shift was clearly not what he'd prepared for. He'd practiced managing my emotional breakdown. He hadn't practiced negotiating with an equally informed and prepared spouse. Patricia had warned me this would happen. That men who planned secret separations often fell apart when their strategy was disrupted. That control was intoxicating, and losing it was destabilizing. I watched it happen in real time. Garrett's careful composure became irritability. His strategic patience became frustration. His calm confidence became visible anxiety about outcomes he could no longer fully control. And through it all, I maintained the same steady calm I'd shown since first discovering his document. Because his anxiety wasn't my problem to manage anymore. We agreed to tell close family and friends together rather than letting rumors and speculation control the narrative. The conversations were difficult, but I insisted they be handled calmly and factually. We were separating. It was a mutual decision. We'd work out details fairly. Each conversation Garrett looked increasingly uncomfortable. Because calm, mature separation announcements didn't allow him to control the story the way he'd probably planned. Without drama or clear fault, without me being hysterical or him being the reasonable one, the truth stood on its own. We were ending our marriage. That was the fact, stripped of the spin he'd likely planned to put on it. Friends asked private questions later. Asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if this had been sudden. I was honest in ways that didn't trash Garrett but didn't protect him either. It hadn't been sudden for him. He'd been planning for months. It had been sudden for me initially, but I'd had time to prepare since discovering his plans. That I was doing better than expected because I'd sought help early. People drew their own conclusions from those simple facts. I didn't need to paint Garrett as a villain. His choices spoke for themselves when laid out chronologically and honestly. He'd planned a secret exit while maintaining false normalcy. People understood what that meant about his character without me needing to explicitly condemn it. And Garrett couldn't control or manage that narrative no matter how much he clearly wanted to. The truth was simply the truth, and it reflected poorly on him without me needing to add editorial comment. The practical details of separation were resolved over the following weeks with professional mediation. Patricia represented my interests. Garrett's attorney represented his. Everything was documented, negotiated clearly, and formalized legally. It was clean and fair in ways that Garrett's original unilateral plan hadn't been. Asset division recognized my contributions to our marriage and household. Financial arrangements acknowledged the career sacrifices I'd made for his advancement. Timeline for separation provided both of us adequate transition time, rather than rushing to suit his preferred schedule. Throughout the process, Garrett kept glancing at me like he was still waiting for something. Waiting for me to break down emotionally. Waiting for the woman he'd thought he was outmaneuvering to finally appear so he could manage her the way he'd planned. That woman never appeared. I stayed calm, informed, and focused on fair outcomes through every mediation session. My attorney had prepared me well. I understood my rights and options. I knew what was reasonable to ask for and what wasn't. I negotiated from knowledge rather than emotion. It was nothing like what Garrett had expected, I could tell. His frustration became increasingly evident as sessions progressed, and he realized he wasn't going to get the strategic advantages his secret planning was supposed to provide. We were just two people dividing shared assets fairly under legal guidance. His months of preparation hadn't bought him the control he'd anticipated. Just wasted time maintaining lies that had ultimately been discovered anyway. That realization seemed to settle over him gradually during those weeks. The defeat of strategy by accidental early discovery. Garrett moved out on a Saturday morning 3 months after that initial conversation. I watched him load boxes into his car from the living room window, feeling a strange mix of emotions that wasn't quite the devastation I'd expected. Relief was there. The weight of his deception had been heavy, and its absence felt lighter even though the practical end of our marriage was objectively sad. Exhaustion too. Maintaining composure through months of negotiation had required energy even with professional support. But mostly what I felt was space. Breathing room. The ability to exist without performing for someone who'd been lying to me systematically. A future that was uncertain but at least honest. The house felt different after his car drove away. Quieter. No longer filled with the tension that had defined these past months. No more watching him try to manage situations he couldn't control. No more negotiations or mediation sessions. Just space. Just silence. Just the beginning of whatever came next without someone else's secret agenda shaping my reality. There was no victory parade in my mind. No celebration that I'd caught him before he'd fully executed his plan. Just acceptance that this marriage had ended and I'd protected myself as best I could once I'd learned it was ending. That felt sufficient. Not triumphant, but sufficient. I'd survived betrayal. Protected my interests. Advocated for myself effectively despite circumstances that could have left me devastated and unprepared. That was enough. That had to be enough. Months after the separation was finalized, I learned something through mutual friends that I hadn't expected. Garrett's reputation in our social circle had developed fractures that wouldn't easily heal. People had noticed details he probably thought were private or unimportant. That he'd been planning secret separation while maintaining false normalcy. That his wife had only discovered his intentions by accident. That everything he'd claimed about mutual decision-making and growing apart had been contradicted by the timeline of events. His careful planning hadn't protected him from social scrutiny. It had made that scrutiny sharper. Because people understood what methodical secret planning revealed about someone's character. What it meant that he'd hired attorneys and drafted documents while kissing his wife goodnight and discussing vacation plans. His reputation, which he'd built carefully on appearing to have integrity and honesty in personal and professional contexts, had visible fractures now. Colleagues treated him slightly differently according to people who'd noticed. Friends were cooler. Social invitations came less frequently. Nothing dramatic or overt. Just the subtle social consequences of people reassessing someone they'd thought they knew. I hadn't caused those consequences. Hadn't bad-mouthed him or campaigned for people to view him negatively. The facts of his behavior had simply become known, and people had drawn natural conclusions. That was justice I hadn't sought but appreciated nonetheless. Real accountability that existed separate from legal or financial outcomes. The social reality that planning to betray your spouse comes with reputational costs no strategy can fully prevent. My own rebuilding happened more steadily and quietly than I'd anticipated. I returned to marketing work, initially as a consultant and then with increasing client commitment as my confidence returned. The career momentum I'd sacrificed for Garrett's travel schedule came back quickly once I fully invested myself again. Confidence followed professional success naturally. Each completed project, each satisfied client, each professional achievement reminded me I was capable and skilled independent of my marriage identity. I'd been someone's wife for 12 years. Now I was discovering who I was beyond that role. The process was sometimes difficult but mostly clarifying. I wasn't surviving the end of my marriage. I was directing my own life again. Making decisions based on my preferences without accommodation or compromise. Building routines that served my needs and interests. Creating a future shaped entirely by my own goals rather than partnership requirements. The difference was profound. Not because partnership was inherently bad, but because this particular partnership had been fundamentally dishonest for longer than I'd known. Being free of that dishonesty, even at the cost of the marriage itself, was ultimately liberating. Could breathe fully. Could make plans without wondering if the person beside me was secretly planning to leave. Could trust my own judgment without being gaslit about financial decisions or relationship health. That trust in myself, rebuilt slowly over months of post-separation life, was perhaps what I'd actually lost during the marriage. Garrett's systematic deception had made me doubt my own perceptions. Living honestly again, even alone, had restored confidence in my ability to see clearly and assess situations accurately. Looking back on that moment when the laptop chimed innocently and destroyed my understanding of my marriage, I could see the lesson clearly now. Garrett had thought silence meant weakness. Had thought preparation and planning belonged exclusively to him because I was trusting and therefore naive. Had thought strategic advantage came from keeping secrets and controlling timing. What he'd never understood, what his entire strategy had been built on not understanding, was that the moment I saw that separation document, everything changed fundamentally. I'd stopped being his audience and become my own advocate. I'd stopped trusting his performance and started preparing for reality. I'd stopped being the wife he thought he could manage and become someone he'd never anticipated dealing with. His secret planning had been sophisticated. His timeline had been carefully calculated. His approach had been legally advised. But all of it had depended on one assumption, that I would remain ignorant until he chose to inform me. When that assumption failed, through accident, through a carelessly opened laptop, through sheer chance, his entire strategy had crumbled. Because preparation only provides advantage if the other party isn't also preparing. Information only creates leverage if you're the only one who has it. Control only exists when the other person doesn't realize they're being controlled. The moment I'd discovered his plan, I'd become an equal participant in our separation rather than a managed subject. That shift had made all the difference. Not just in outcomes but in how I'd experience the process. With agency. With preparation. With the ability to protect myself rather than simply react to his announcements. He'd taught me something valuable through his betrayal. That silence could be strategic rather than defeated. That patience could be more powerful than immediate confrontation. That knowledge, even painful knowledge, was always better than comfortable ignorance. Those lessons had served me well through separation and continued serving me after. I'd rebuilt my life on foundations of honesty and self-advocacy that were stronger than partnership based on deception ever could have been. And that, ultimately, was the real victory. Not defeating Garrett or punishing his planning, but becoming someone who valued her own interests enough to protect them competently. Someone who wouldn't be easily betrayed again because she'd learned to notice patterns and trust her perceptions. Someone who understood that the best response to strategic deception was strategic preparation. He'd planned to blindside me. Instead, he'd educated me. And that education had changed everything about who I became after our marriage ended.